On this episode, I'm speaking with Andrew Katz, founder of Katz Development. Since 2015, Andrew has participated in the development of approximately $350 million of multifamily, office, retail, and hospitality projects, totaling roughly 1 million square feet between Colorado and Ohio. This is a really fun one for me because I had the fortune of meeting Andrew quite a few years ago in the Rhino neighborhood of Denver. We've stayed in touch ever since. And through COVID to now, his new mass timber project, Return to Form, is finally taking shape and set to break ground later in 2023. Really great conversation with Andrew, learning more about his upbringing, how he got to where he is today, and of course, talking mass timber, challenges, opportunities, and some really good conversation around Return to Form, 12-story multifamily project coming to the River North neighborhood in Denver. Without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Andrew and get going. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I love getting started with the where you're from stories, and I'd love to hear about where you grew up, what your family and friends were like, if you had any family destinations that in particular stood out for you, all that good stuff. So let's get started there.
Sure. So not super exciting. Grew up in the suburbs of Cincinnati, Ohio. Have 2 younger brothers, handful of friends that actually a lot of them now live out here in Denver nearby as well, which is pretty fun. But yeah, very typical, Midwest upbringing. We would actually come out to Colorado frequently on vacation, which was, we were very fortunate to be able to come out here to go skiing and hiking in the summers, and was a big part of what led me to Denver ultimately. But yeah, spent my whole childhood in Cincinnati. I went to school, also nearby in Columbus at Ohio State, and stayed in that general Midwest region until I was done with school.
Nice. And so I want to pause and go back to the vacation destination comment, because that's actually something that I was fortunate enough to do as well. My family would always pack us up. We would drive overnight to get to Colorado. We would do camping and hiking trips. Sometimes we would stay in tents, and then as we got older, we would rent a cabin for a week or whatever and do a bunch of hiking around. So, but it sounds like a lot of your trips were ski focused. That's really cool. Did you do any particular destinations in Colorado, or did you go to different ski resorts?
Yeah, we skied in Colorado. We skied in Utah a little bit, but it was like my dad, he didn't have the ability to grow up learning how to ski. He learned much later in life, and I think he just made it a point of his to teach us when we were young. And so, we learned how to ski when we were like 2 or 3 years old. My brothers and I, just on the little like leash thing where you ski between your dad's legs. And I grew up learning on a tiny little hill in Indiana called Perfect North. And, when we felt confident enough there, parents took us out to Colorado. We'd ski at Vail a lot. We'd ski in Deer Valley in Utah sometimes. But, it was always like the highlight of my year was the 4 or 5 days that we could go skiing in Colorado. It was just such a different, obviously different than the hill in Indiana, and just felt like such a big world. And, it was definitely something we always look forward to.
I remember one time you told me a story about a particular hike in Colorado. There's a couple of a pair of 14ers. Their names are Grays and Tories, and it's a really popular front range hike. But there's a particular way that you can access the peaks up this ridge called Kelso Ridge. And I remember laughing with you about it because we've both done that route now, but we also both have the mindset of what it feels like to be a Midwesterner to go to Colorado and do these types of things, which as anyone who has had experience like that knows, it doesn't always turn out the best. What was that like? Was that when you were really little, or were you a teenager? When did you get to have those experiences?
Yeah, we started trying out 14ers when I was probably 15, I think, was when we did our first one. And so, we can hike all we want in Ohio, but it's just, it doesn't compare. You're not getting the same, obviously, in terms of altitude and and just it's just a whole different world. And so we went out. I remember my dad was all excited. He's like, I've been reading up about these 14ers. I think we should go give them a try. And so we planned this trip to go. We were staying in Georgetown, and we would climb Grays and Torreys. It was our first one. And I guess he felt that the standard route wasn't, we were too good for the standard route, given our Ohio hiking experience. And so we took this Kelso Ridge route, which, on paper didn't seem crazy, but we went for it. We had absolutely no 14er experience, no experience being at that kind of altitude. We flew in from Ohio the night before, woke up at, 2 a.m. to get to the trailhead. And it was one of the most fun hikes I've ever done. Kelso Ridge is a really cool, fun trail. But I was not prepared for, class 3, class 4 scrambling and exposure and the knife's edge. And there was some interesting moves on that trail, but it was a fun experience, and definitely, put us on the path to, we'd start to come out and climb 14ers every summer after that for years.
So for anyone watching or listening, definitely contact Andrew for a self-guided tour up Kelso Ridge in the future.
I'd go back, but I think I know, what I'm getting into at this point.
Right. Well, let's transition to real estate a bit. Did you always grow up, and did you head into college with this idea that, okay, real estate's going to be my thing? I know this going in. Was it pre-planned for you, or where did that spark start for you?
Yeah, 100%. My dad is a developer, and he's still in Cincinnati. I grew up watching him, and he's an entrepreneur. He, started his own company. And when you grow up in the real estate business, it's always around you, especially in an entrepreneurial, one where you just get involved in all kinds of stuff. And we go and look at the properties, and, just constantly talking about different deals that he's working on. And so from a young age, it was always kind of there, and something that we were learning and something that we were exposed to. And it was a really appealing thing for us to see our dad, who just had this, he was always obviously busy, but had total control over his schedule, and, was able to come to our, school sport events or whatever. And he would, always had time to do whatever it is that he wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And so that was really appealing. And I just, in my head, I was always, Dad's your hero. I always wanted to just do what he did. And as I got older, it started to become more clear what that actually means. But if you had asked me, from a very young age, what I wanted to do when I grew up, it was to be a real estate developer. And I bet when, I first started saying that, I had no idea what that even meant, but it's been pretty consistent.
And you went to Ohio State for, I believe it was business and real estate, if I'm recalling correctly there. As you moved through your college experience and taking these courses in both business and real estate, did you have your eye on any particular city? Were you thinking you'd go back to Colorado, or what was in the cards for you post college? What did that look like?
I think I always wanted to move to Colorado. From when I started going to school at Ohio State, I don't remember exactly when I kind of made that decision in my head, but I remember throughout college, that was what I would tell people. I'm going to move to Denver. I'm going to be in real estate. I didn't know what particularly I was going to do in real estate. I didn't know Denver at all. We would go skiing out here, but we never really spent a lot of time in the city. We would always just, drive by on the way to the mountains. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just, I knew that real estate was very fluid, and there were a lot of different ways you could go with it, especially if you were going to be entrepreneurial within it, and you can kind of do it anywhere. And so I figured it would be more fun to do it in a place where I can drive to go skiing on the weekends, which again was like the highlight of my year. And it was a whole production. You had to pack up, get on a plane, drive to, I-70 to Vail, and, to have access to that whenever you wanted just sounded pretty appealing.
And so you arrived in Denver in the mid 2010s, and you jumped right into the real estate scene, but potentially not in the way that listeners might expect. So, in Denver at the time was changing quite a bit already. Personally, I moved to Denver in the mid 2000s, and completely different scene between 2005 and 2015, as you can imagine. But okay, so picture it, we're roughly around 2015. Where did you start when you came out to Denver? What did that first experience, what was that comprised of?
Yeah, so I finished school, and my main goal was to find a job, just something to bring me to Denver. I was pretty focused on starting in retail brokerage. That was what my dad started in. It was kind of, following his advice and his path. So I reached out to a bunch of different brokerages after our graduation and came out a few times to interview with a few of them. And eventually a group here called Sullivan Hayes told me to come on out. And so I moved out here kind of late half of 2015. And yeah, I didn't really know what I was doing. I stayed in like an extended hotel for a week or so until I found an apartment. I was used to suburban Ohio. I figured I would move somewhere in the tech center or in one of the suburbs or Golden or something like that. I ended up instead moving into a building in Cap Hill, and decided to try out, being more into the city to start. And so yeah, that was it. Moved to Cap Hill and started out in retail brokerage and just figuring it out from there.
One of the things that you told me early on is that you remember that time as being the days where you drove around for hours on end, not making much money, learning the city, trying to figure out who the players were and how things worked more or less. But I also remember one of the conversations we had around you having this realization around that time, through that experience with Sullivan Hayes for a few years, that you realized that wasn't necessarily where your passion was really hitting you at the core where you wanted it to.
Yeah, I mean, brokerage was a great place for me at that time in my life. It was a really great way to learn the city. It was a great way to just meet a ton of different people, and then also just kind of learn the fundamentals of deal making and, how things were structured out here. And, working with Sullivan Hayes was also just really fun. They were just really fun people. They took me in, they, showed me around. I created some amazing relationships there that are still, very important to me. And yeah, it was a great place to start. I drove around constantly, just, it's a great way to learn how the city works and just start to pick spots and figure it out.
And you had this really cool habit that I want to mention, because I think the listeners will find this really cool, but you developed this, I'll call it a habit, and it has to do with maps, because as you became familiar with Denver, one of the things that you said you started to do was literally start to draw and outline your own maps and notate your own maps of the city as you learned it. Where did that come from, and what did that like physically actually look like? Was it like something that you wrote down? Was it digitally? How did these maps come about?
Yeah, it wasn't very, structured or thoughtful. It was kind of back in 2015, 2016, I was exposed to all kinds of different deals. I was working on anything from, a suburban a gas station deal out in Arvada to, a coffee shop downtown somewhere. And one of the neighborhoods that I just kept coming back to was Rhino, the River North Arts District, kind of northeast of town. And, it was just really starting to take shape, I think, back then in 2015. And if you just drove around it, it was not much to look at. It's very, jumbled. There's new development here and there. There's some built out streets. There's some dirt roads. There's some, it's just kind of a hodgepodge. And so I noticed a lot of interest in buying land there from larger developers, from multifamily developers, from folks who want to build, the next cool mixed use project. And so for me, a way to kind of organize the neighborhood was there's this program on Google Maps. It's called My Maps, and you can kind of lay, shapes and notes on top of Google Maps. And so I just started doing that. Basically, I would just lay, if there was a site that traded and it was in the newspaper or something, I would draw a little boundary around it. I would write in the notes who bought it, what they paid for it, what they were going to build here, how big the site was, any kind of important information around the sale. And so I just started doing that. I started accumulating all of these different sites from the newspapers and from, people that I would just hear about different deals. And so it started to just create this big, vision of the neighborhood. And it helped me to recognize where gaps were. And then I would go and, approach those landowners, and that would kind of lead to, trying to find off-market deals for some of these developers that wanted to buy these sites.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic. Authentic delivers premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Our proven approach aims to accelerate leasing velocity, boost rental rates, and increase long-term value. Simply put, we see brand as a business asset. You can find out more at AuthenticFF.com. And it seems like efforts like that, or maybe awareness like that, actually led to the purchase of the site for the development that we're going to be talking about today, the mass timber development in Denver. It probably didn't feel like a straight line like that, but I mean, as you were driving around and figuring things out, you did come across a site that you felt like fit the vision for what you had in mind at the time. Walk us through what that looked like, because that was around 2016, 2017, I believe, at the time.
Yep. Yeah, that was around that time. It wasn't even that thought out. It was, we didn't have a vision. I think at that point, the idea was more, I knew I wanted to be in development. I knew that brokerage would lead me there. And the goal was to do something with my dad out here in Denver. And so we came across this site, and it was, right in the middle of that map that I made. And I just thought, man, this is a great location. It was listed. It's right at the corner of 35th and Wynkoop Street. So it's kind of, straddles both sides of Rhino, being right at that pedestrian bridge and by the light rail. And so, I knew that it was too small for a lot of the clients that I was looking for land sites for in Rhino. And so I didn't take it to any of them. I just took it to my dad and I said, hey, I don't know what we would do with this, but this is a really good development site. And it's too small for a lot of these bigger players, but we could do something fun here. And I know it doesn't look like much. I think that the tenant the guy who owned it at the time, I think there were, chickens in the backyard. There was a chicken coop. It was very Wild West, and Brighton Boulevard hadn't quite been redone yet. We knew a lot of stuff was coming, and that map really helped paint the picture of it. But it was pretty rough when we came across the site. And so not very linear. We liked the location and we liked the price, and I convinced Dad that we should buy this.
Yeah. And for anyone who's familiar with Denver or has been familiar with Denver over the last 10 years or so, I mean, this site with Andrew's company is right over by the Source, the original Source, now the Source Hotel as well, Zeppelin Station, right along Brighton Boulevard, which, to your point, was sort of trying to figure itself out back in 2017. But I digress. Around that time, you ended up connecting with a mentor of yours, someone who's helped you tremendously kind of find your feet, get your feet wet, and now sort of find your sea legs as you become a young developer in Denver. And it is connected to a site called Modo, I believe, on 8th and Sherman and Cap Hill in Denver. Tell us about that moment, because I think that's a really poignant moment in your brief journey so far, but I think it's really cool.
Yeah, so I told you I was all over the map in terms of where I was going to live when I first moved here, and I settled on living in this building that had just opened called the Modo. It's 8th and Sherman. just really cool, funky design. I liked the look of the building and the feeling of it. I, took the smallest studio I could find in there. And one day I was walking out of the building and I saw this group of people in the lobby kind of talking about it. And I just was walking by and heard some of the conversation, and I realized that these people were the developers in the building. And, growing up, a lot of the development my dad was focused on was suburban retail stuff. So building Chipotle's, building strip centers, building, just retail focused things in the suburbs. And so, that stuff wasn't necessarily exciting to me on a personal level. But what was exciting to me was design and urbanism. And, this group of people had just built this building in this urban neighborhood that had really cool design. And I had to learn more. And so I walked up to one of them and I just said, "Hey, look, I'm a broker. I'm trying to get into development. It seems like you guys developed this building. I'd love to get a coffee with you and just learn about that process and what this kind of development is." And so there's a guy named Jonathan Alpert who's with Westfield Company now. And, we went to coffee, we became great friends. I met his family. He was really, truly, I think, my first friend that I met out here in Denver, and just totally took me under his wing. And he actually started in a similar way. I think he actually started at Sullivan Hayes as well, was the first stop in his career. And so, we just had a lot to connect over and had a lot of shared interests on our personal lives. And so for me, it was just, it just felt like I had found something where my personal interests kind of, meshed with the development world. And that was really exciting.
Yeah. You said to me that you felt like it was the first time that you could see an opportunity where design and real estate were really intersecting. And it sounded like that was something that really excited you and kind of ignited or maybe forged together, like what kind of has become your passion as a developer in your young career. And so that actually springboarded you into this next phase of your career, which let's definitely talk about that briefly before we get into mass timber. But you ended up pivoting and working with Westfield, obviously a really well-respected firm in Denver, and they've been a part of many exciting projects in the city. When you transitioned away from Sullivan Hayes into the Westfield position, did you end up sort of working on, was it like a catch-all role with them, or did you work on specific properties across the city?
Yeah, it was basically a catch-all role, but they were focused on some larger projects at the time, and so those were the ones where I spent most of my time. But yeah, it was, I think, 2017, and we had bought our site. I was still with Sullivan Hayes. I bugged Jonathan incessantly saying, "Hey, look, I've got this site. I know it's a good site in Rhino. I know Rhino. This is a similar play to Moto. It's got to be. What do I do with it? Do you want to work together on it? This should be a cool apartment building. This should be something interesting." And he's like, "Slow down. I have a lot of stuff I'm working on at Westfield. Why don't you come help me out and, get some development experience?" And, so we ended up finding some folks to lease the building from us, and we felt comfortable just sitting on it for a bit and letting some of the projects break ground around us and let the neighborhood, develop for a little longer. So, which ended up being a really helpful thing, because we were pretty early back then in 2017, and what we might have built back then is a lot different than what we would have done today. And so I'm very glad that we hit the pause button, and I am incredibly glad that I went to Westfield. It was by far the most transformative, experience I could have possibly had. And so, yeah, I went to Westfield in 2017, and the projects that I was most involved with over there were, they owned this 14-acre site in Rhino at the north end, over by, I think it was between like 42nd and 44th and Brighton and Wynkoop Street. So a couple city blocks in an opportunity zone by the highway, by the stock show, redevelopment, and then all of the, amazing things happening in Rhino to the south. And so when I first came there, they had signed up AEG to build the Mission Ballroom. And so that was a project I spent a lot of time on, was that project. And then across the plaza from Mission Ballroom was a 90,000 square foot office and retail building. And then beyond those two, there was a lot of, conceptual planning and master planning and trying to lay out the proper program for such a big, basically, campus. It was a truly like placemaking type of development. And so that was incredibly fun. And I am, so thankful to have been able to be involved in that project in any small way that I could. And so I spent a lot of time with that. And then also spent a lot of time on the other side of Rhino. There is a project called Spark, which is short for Sustainability Park. It's a 100-unit condo deal at 26th and Lawrence. It was a really fun deal. I think it had just broken ground when I had gotten there. And so, I spent a lot of time in the construction phase, and we had leased the anchor retail building to a restaurant out of Texas called Uchi, which was a really fun project and a beautiful building. And then did a fun thing with a greenhouse operation called Altius Farms above Uchi. And then beyond construction, was really involved in the condo sale process and the marketing and, getting the condos sold, which was a whole new world to me. And so those were the two projects I probably spent the most time working on. Also spent a little bit of time at Stanley Marketplace out in the Central Park neighborhood, which was a really fun project that it had already been, long established by the time I got there. But got to see how that thing operated, and helped a little bit with some conceptual planning of some apartments that are, I think, just wrapping up construction now, that are going to be really amazing. And then a few other projects here and there that we had poked around at, but those were the main ones that I got to be involved in. And yeah, I was really a catch-all. I think my title was development associate. So I worked primarily with Jonathan and with Kevin McClintock over there. And I mean, everyone in the Westfield team. I had a blast over there. It was a lot of learning, and yeah, very thankful for my time there.
Yeah, that's really cool to be able to have cut your teeth with such a strong and experienced team in Denver like that, because obviously not a lot of people are able to happenstance find them in a lobby, to start a conversation, to have a coffee, to then go begin working for them. That's a really cool, invaluable experience that you were able to have in those few years. And essentially that brings us to the point where you decided, hey, you know what, I think this might be the time for me to step out on my own, start what is now Katz Development, do something with this, this site that we've had for a few years now. And I feel fortunate enough to have run across you maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. And so I was having conversations with you when you were thinking about it being a condo deal, when you were thinking about it being a hotel concept. I mean, I know that you've had to go through different iterations, and to your comment earlier, in a way, let the neighborhood around it grow up and sort of fill in and figure itself out. But this brought you to 2019, 2020. Where did the site sit at that time, and was mass timber like in the cards yet once you started to transition away from Westfield?
Yeah, so around that time, end of 2019, we had just finished Mission Ballroom. Spark was finished, and most of the units were sold, or a good majority, I think, at that point. And it was kind of in between projects over there, and it just felt like the right time to step away and focus on the family site. It had been, several years that it was just sitting there, and I felt like I had gained a tremendous amount of experience and had the confidence to go and try and figure this out. And so I left. Mass timber was something that I was aware of at that point. I had looked at it a little bit at Westfield, and I didn't fully understand it, but I was interested by it. I think the thing that sparked it was I had toured a project here called Plat 15 downtown along Platt Street. It's an office building, 5 stories, and it was built out of mass timber. And I walked through it, and I was just blown away by what mass timber actually was, and what it felt like, and how it looked, and what the construction process was like. And that kind of put the idea in our heads a little bit. We actually wanted to do a hotel at the time, and we were going to try and do a mass timber boutique hotel. And this was, again, end of 2019. And so we started down that path. We brought in the design team, and I think we had gotten to the point where our concept plan was approved by the city, which is the first, very preliminary step, like right in February or March of 2020. And then COVID hit, and we, at first we kind of just paused the project, and we were like, we'll see what happens. We had spent a lot of time on it, and just at that point, I don't think we could have really imagined not going that direction. But it became pretty clear after a few months that no, we really are not going to build a hotel here. It was not it was not possible at that point in time. And so I think like mid 2020 we decided to cancel it, which it definitely hurt. We were pretty excited about it, but maybe one day in the future we'll come back.
And I think if I remember the timeline approximately, it was okay, COVID. I mean, and obviously for a lot of people, but COVID for you guys, it was like, okay, gut check. What are we doing? Where are we headed now? Kind of like, are there other ideas here? Where can we take this? Because you had owned the site for, I think, 4 or 5 years at that point. And I think that you had mentioned that you guys were just ready to get something rolling. And for you, of course, this is your first big project as Katz Development, and it matters. Let's talk about this transition, and because this is truly where mass timber comes into play. Your project returned to form. You ended up embracing it head on, but not as a hotel. It ended up becoming, it took a different form, pun intended, I guess, as I say it out loud. But what is that form that you're working on now?
Yeah. So we were really excited about a hotel because we felt like, I was very lucky at Westfield to have worked on projects that, Mission Ballroom was, at least in my opinion, it felt like something that added to the neighborhood. It felt like something that, brought new energy and had a culture around it, and made Rhino a more fun place than it even already was. And so that's kind of how we viewed a hotel on our site at that time, was how can we do something that makes this neighborhood, even better than it already is. And it was very disappointing when we couldn't go that route anymore, but we were trying to figure out, okay, what can we do here? And multifamily was not only something that we could do per the zoning, but also something that, we felt like it was a desirable location for multifamily. And so the first thing we were thinking through was, how do we make something within multifamily that is additive to the neighborhood? Because there's a lot of multifamily coming. Obviously we have a need for housing, and every unit that we're able to bring online is incredibly helpful. But from a neighborhood culture standpoint, it's hard to really quantify or see the positive impacts of multifamily projects. Not a lot of them are, incredibly focused on pedestrian levels, street activation, and on, culture and urban fabric. And so that was kind of some of the things we were thinking about as we pivoted away from hotel and into multifamily. And so, that the one thing that really stuck with us as a common thread was the mass timber, because not only did we think that, it was beautiful, but we started learning about the environmental benefits of mass timber when compared to traditional construction methods like concrete and steel. And we started learning about other projects in other markets that were using mass timber, and kind of watching those processes. And eventually we were like, this is it. It's we had a few other thoughts as well. We were a small little site. Our site's about a quarter of an acre, and we have some dense zoning, so we can go up to 12 stories. But, we always knew it was going to be a small project, and almost all of the buildings in Rhino are big, and they have big, beefy amenities. They've got, the big pool decks. They've got, all of the fancy things. And we knew with the size of our site, we just weren't going to be able to provide everything that these big, massive 400 to 500 unit complexes were doing. And so the key word that we were, latched onto was differentiation. How can we differentiate? We're going to be, around 100 units in this sea of, there's currently 3,000 units under construction. How do we stand out? Because if we try and do what these other people are doing, we're not going to win. We're not going to win if we try and compete with Drivetrain, or if we try and compete with, some of these just Mill Creek projects, or any of the other ones that Carmel Partners are building. They're just a different product. And so, one of the ways that we thought we could stand out was using mass timber, both from an aesthetic differentiation standpoint, because as we can get into later, it's a totally different look. Your unit, it's you have the exposed wood ceilings, you have exposed columns and beams. Your whole living area is, covered in wood, which is obviously different aesthetically. But then also just the narrative of doing something in the construction industry that is forward thinking, and that, is hopefully a path forward for the industry that is a little less harmful on the environment. And so, that's kind of the mess of thoughts that we had that created the mass timber motif there.
Yeah. And I guess to name drop a few other projects, because we were talking about how, you had this loose vision in your mind, but, you were also aware of Ascent being built in Milwaukee at the time. I remember you talking about Hotel Magdalena in Austin quite a bit as one that you really enjoyed. Obviously, Plat 15 that you mentioned previous in this conversation. The CLT, or the mass timber piece, seemed to sort of stick with you at that time. And you were alluding to, it's not just about the design. It's not just about kind of figuring out who you're competing against, but the real thing here is actually the planet, and how, it's not just like a nice to have. It literally is so much better for the planet and for the development of the building at its core. What are some of the ways that mass timber is legitimately better for the planet from an emission standpoint, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, so I can speak high level, but I'm definitely not qualified, so take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah,
but,
fair enough.
The basic idea is that some 40% of our global carbon emissions come from buildings, and they come from buildings and from the operations of buildings. And so when you dive into the construction of buildings, a majority of those carbon emissions come from the construction with, concrete and steel. They're just incredibly energy intensive processes to work with, and they emit a lot of carbon during the process. And so the way that mass timber works at a high level is you have trees that are grown in sustainably harvested forests. As trees grow and get taller, they actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and they trap it in their limbs. And so, trees, they pull the most carbon out when they're young. And so as they get older and mature, there becomes a time when they aren't pulling as much carbon from the atmosphere. And so there's kind of this like ideal point in time in a tree's life where you want to harvest that tree. It's pulled a majority of its carbon out of the air. You cut it down, you replant a new tree in its place, and you take the trees and you can basically create these engineered wood products called mass timber, which, is kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different products. Some of the more popular ones are called cross-laminated timber, which is for, floor and ceiling decks, basically just different layers of timber kind of laid in a cross pattern and glued together and compressed to form these big, thick panels. Then there's other products called glue lam, which are really good for columns and beams. There's LVL, there's NLT, there's DLT. There's all different kinds of mass timber products out there that are all really cool and innovative. And so essentially, what you have is these kind of almost componentized, building materials, these columns, beams, and then floor and ceiling decks that essentially store carbon, because all of the carbon that the trees pulled out of the atmosphere when they were harvested is trapped still in these products that then, come to the site and are installed very quickly and become the superstructure of the building. And so rather than the structure being made out of a very energy intensive material like concrete or steel, it's made with these wood, members that are storing carbon in them and will continue to store carbon forever for the life of the wood. And so that's high level how it's different from concrete and steel.
And I'm sure that there are naysayers out there, right, that point to cutting down trees as being a really bad thing. Actually, it's actually, they pull carbon out of the atmosphere, but you're cutting them down. How can this be good? Can you explain? Again, feel free to hang the banner of the disclaimer of high level, but I know a thing or two about this. Why does it work, and how does it work? Because you'd think, okay, if I'm cutting down a bunch of trees in a forest, that's a problem. That's a problem. How can that be sustainable?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I get it all the time. Again, I'm still not qualified to answer it properly, but from what I know, the key here is that you have to work with forests that are sustainably managed. And so essentially what that means is that, if you have a North American forest, or, they have forest, privately owned forest lands all over the world, really, but let's just use a North American one, for example. It's for the most part, it's a for-profit industry. And so, these lumber mills, they harvest wood, they convert them to different wood products, and they do that at a profit. And so when it comes to mass timber and the thought of cutting down trees, it being bad for the environment, well, in reality, it does a lot of things to cut down trees. So number one is, like I mentioned before, trees do stop sequestering and pulling carbon from the atmosphere at a high rate as they hit a certain age. And so, just leaving a forest untouched is not necessarily the best thing when it comes to pulling carbon from the air. And so harvesting trees is a good thing from that perspective. It's also just an overall capitalism thing, right? Like, if you are operating as a profitable forest and it's a product that's in high demand as mass timber and people are building with it, then you're going to continue operating that forest land as a for-profit lumber mill. And if Amazon or somebody comes along and says, hey, I want to buy, 800 acres from you, and I'm going to turn it into an industrial park or a distribution center, that's where we get into problems with forest land, is clear cutting. And so if you have a healthy lumber economy and it's profitable to continue to operate these mills, they're harvesting just a tiny little fraction of the amount of forest land that they have available right now. Like, we're not running out of trees anytime soon. And every time they harvest, they're continually replanting because it's in their best interest as a business. And so, whenever people bring this up, that's always what I come back to, is the real problem is if there's no interest or demand in forest products or in wood products, and it's more profitable for these folks to sell their land and go do something else. And that's when we lose the trees permanently. Yeah.
Well, so the forest issue aside, there still are many other issues and or question marks that come up with mass timber development. Fire is one of them. Just how the longevity of the structures is another. Some of the things that I would love to dig into as we start to wrap up have to do with the challenges that you faced, because I know it hasn't been just one. And I know quite a few are actually focused around just the way that the current code is written, the building code is written in general. Can you dive into some of those challenges that you've faced? And if you've been able to find a success here or there, feel free to highlight that as well.
Yeah, sure. So when we first started down this path, we knew that there were some code challenges involved with building mass timber at certain heights. And so, like I mentioned, Plat 15, I think, was one of Denver's first mass timber buildings. It's 5 stories. As you go up in height, it gets a little more challenging. So for just a little bit of backstory, the 2021 International Building Code introduced mass timber as a building type for the first time in 3 different types of construction. So it's type 4 heavy timber, and it's type 4A, which is the tallest, type 4B, which is kind of a mid-range, and then type 4C, which is the shortest. And so that kind of breaks down to you can go up 18 stories in type A, around 12 stories in type B, and then 7 or 8 stories in type C. And so as you increase in height, there were these regulations on how much of the CLT ceilings were allowed to be exposed, how much of the wood could be unprotected by, gypcrete or drywall. And that was all based on some older fire safety testing that had been done. It was a very conservative kind of metric. So for example, if you wanted to build 18 stories in type 4A, you are required to cover 100% of the wood. There can be no exposed wood in that structure from a fire concern standpoint. And so in type 4B, which is where we knew our project would end up at 12 stories, that limit was at 20%. So we were only allowed to expose 20% of those CLT ceilings and those wood columns and beams in the structure. And that is a big challenge for us.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, it's a challenge on a number of fronts, but basically, overall, mass timber is more expensive than concrete or steel. It's just a more expensive material. But there are ways that you can claw back, that cost premium and bring it into a more competitive place with concrete and steel. And one of the places that you can do that is through finished materials. If you're building a concrete building and it's multifamily, chances are you're going to want to finish the ceilings with drywall. And if you're able to expose the mass timber, that's a big cost saver, is not having to cover up, 80% of your ceiling.
Huge saver, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's definitely a big deal. And it's also it defeats the purpose. The whole point
the aesthetic is lost.
Yeah, you lose the aesthetic, but also you're covering this renewable resource that's storing carbon with a toxic, non-reusable and non-renewable resource like drywall. And so it didn't work for a number of reasons. And so when we started, we knew that would be a hurdle we were going to have to figure out, or else we couldn't build this building. And so I think it was Greg Kingsley with KLNA, our structural engineer, who introduced me to a group of folks that they had written the 2021 International Building Codes. It was a group of incredibly smart architects and fire protection engineers and just building engineers and mass timber advocates. And, I was connected with them. I was told that they were working on an amendment to the International Building Code that you should be able to expose 100% of the CLT in a type 4B structure, which again was ours, up to 12 stories, based on some new fire safety testing that had been done that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that mass timber performs at a superior level in a fire comparable to concrete and probably better than steel, more predictable than steel. And so I got linked up with this group of people and I said, hey, we're building this project. We need this amendment to go through. How can we help? And they said, can you be in Pittsburgh in like 3 days? And I said, sure. And so I got on a plane and went to Pittsburgh and met up with these folks at the annual, or the International Code Council meeting, which is, I think it's on a 3-year cycle, but it's essentially this big meeting where they go through and they update the International Building Code with new amendments and new code language. And, it was a very interesting convention. And so I went out there with this group of people. Again, I am completely unqualified to be there. But they were there to testify in support of this amendment that they had put forth to the Code Council that we should be able to expose 100% of the timber. And so I was there with this group. We testified in support. I think they kind of wanted my perspective from a developer as to why I cared about this at all, because again, I'm in a room of, engineers and fire experts and architects and, code specialists. And so I kind of spoke from my, passion behind mass timber and why I think it was important from a sustainability perspective, and why end users, would appreciate it, and why there's demand for it. And so we had to debate essentially against ready-mix concrete and against gypcrete lobbyists and, all sorts of folks that wanted to, or are afraid rather, of mass timber, becoming a bigger piece of the market share in high-rise construction. And so in the end, the data, won, and this amendment was passed at the 2024 International Building Code level. So now in 2024 IBC, you are allowed to expose 100% of the CLT up to 12 stories. And so, that was a huge win. And we took that to the city of Denver, and Greg Kingsley went to basically Denver's version of the code update committee and said, hey, this just got approved in 2024 International Building Code. Can we bring this forth early? It's a big hurdle in the adoption of mass timber, and it's coming down the pipe. So we should just do it now. And luckily, the city of Denver is very supportive of mass timber, and it was approved unanimously. And so Denver became one of the first cities in the country to adopt this amendment early, ahead of the 2024 code update. And so essentially what that does is, if you're building, a building that is between 8 and 12 stories, now instead of being limited to concrete, steel, and light steel, you are allowed to build with mass timber and expose 100% of the CLT. And so, it's a big game changer for any project in that height range.
Yeah. Andrew, you've been, I know you didn't ask for it, but you've been promoted to somewhat of a spokesperson for mass timber at this point, on a few different levels. And I think it's been really cool to see that from just from a locale perspective, but someone that I know personally. It's been really cool to see you sort of share your knowledge and educate others along the way. I'm going to ask you a really big question here before we start to wrap up. And it is like, looking ahead, what are your hopes for mass timber development in general in the US? Is there a thought or two that comes to mind that, you're like, hey man, I'm on podcasts like this and I'm answering the same questions all the time. What do I want to have come out of this? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think we're on the path, but I just think that mass timber should be something that is always considered, or always in the conversation when it comes to new project development. It has a tremendous number of challenges, and it's a very different process than concrete or steel when it comes to design and procurement and strategy and the way that you build your team. But my goal is that we're going to build this mass timber building in Rhino, and for a little bit, we might be the only mass timber building at that height in the city. But I really hope that that is overtaken quickly, and I hope that it doesn't become this race of like who's the tallest building in it, in every city or every neighborhood. I think it should just, in a perfect world, it becomes mainstream, and it's going to be a question of why isn't this building built out of mass timber? And I just hope that end users start to recognize it and understand the environmental impacts of it compared to concrete or steel. I hope that it drives office tenants' decisions to lease office space in buildings that have more of a climate initiative around the construction and operation. I hope that other design standards like passive house and electric building operations start to become more mainstream too. I know Denver's on the front foot of electrification, because half of the 40% of global carbon emissions comes from the building's actual operations. And so I think that's a really important piece to the puzzle too. And so, tough question, but I just think that in the end, if a majority it's never going to be a majority. There are plenty of instances where mass timber doesn't make sense. But if buildings that it's viable for mass timber or built in that way, I think that would be a huge win for, the environment and the private real estate market and the end users.
Yeah. Andrew, I love the point of view. I love the perspectives here. Let me hit you with a few rapid fire questions before I roll out the red carpet for you. Tell me, what's the most exciting project or two that you've seen in the last year that has to do with mass timber?
So bias, just hometown, bias, but T3 in Rhino is an office building that Hines is building right now over at 35th and Blake. And I think it's a 240,000 square foot office building, but it's just, it's an incredible program that Hines is doing around the country that's really focused on transit and mass timber. And it's a beautiful building. If you're in the neighborhood, it's going up right now, and you can see all of the exposed wood as they install the structure. So very excited about that one. And then also very excited about the Portland Airport. PDX is getting a brand new roof that's entirely made out of locally sourced mass timber, and it's just incredible looking. I had the fortune to be able to check it out about a year ago, and it was under construction, and I think that they are starting to install it at this point of the year. But I can't wait to fly into Portland one day and have that ceiling be installed. It's amazing.
I'll be sure to add these links into our show notes. So for the watchers or listeners, they can easily check these things out and get a look for themselves. All right. One book that you would recommend right now would be what?
Ooh, one book. Well, it's kind of like a real estate nerdy book, but I just finished this book called The New Kings of New York that I really liked. It was a super interesting look into some of the bigger real estate projects and developers in New York that got me excited, but maybe not for everyone.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much again for joining me today. I always like to say there's one more thing for me to do, and that is to roll out the obligatory red carpet for you. Tell the world what you're up to and where they can find you online.
Yeah, so you'll find me just continuing to work on this project, Return to Form. It's the 12-story mass timber deal in Rhino at 35th and Wynkoop Street. Our website is katz-dev.com. I'm on LinkedIn sometimes. I'm on Twitter sometimes. I'm around the neighborhood. So if you see me in Denver, say hey.
Awesome. Andrew, thanks again for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.